Live from the Des Moines Civic Center in Des Moines, Iowa. This is the Republican presidential debate. Here is your host, Robert McNeil.
Good evening. We're about to bring you what many consider the first major event of the 1980 presidential campaign, a debate by 6 Republican presidential candidates. It is sponsored by the Des Moines newspapers, the Register and Tribune, and it comes just 2 weeks before the first real test of the presidential year, the Iowa caucuses. We now go to the Civic Center and to the moderator of the debate, the executive editor of the Des Moines Register,
Welcome
James
to the
Gannon.
Iowa Political Forum, sponsored by the Des Moines Register and Tribune. I am James P. Gannon, executive editor of the Register and Tribune and moderator for this evening's event. I'm speaking tonight from the stage of the Civic Center in downtown Des Moines. In 2 weeks, Iowa will begin the process of choosing the next president of the United States. The Iowa Precinct Caucuses, to be held on January 21, represent the first significant contest among the candidates competing for the 1980 Republican and Democratic presidential nominations. The Register and Tribune Company is sponsoring the Iowa Political Forum to allow the people of this state and the nation to see and compare the candidates who are competing for support in the Iowa caucuses. It had been our hope to present a forum for each party's candidates. Our Democratic debate did not materialize, but we are happy to present tonight a discussion of issues with 6 contenders for the Republican nomination. With us tonight are Congressman Philip Crane of Illinois, Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, Congressman John Anderson of Illinois, former Governor John Connally of Texas, Senator Robert Dole of Kansas, and former Ambassador George Bush of Texas. To question the candidates, we have a panel of 4 journalists, 2 from Iowa and 2 from the national press. Our panel members are Walter Mears, Washington Bureau Chief of the Associated Press; George Anthon, Washington reporter for the Des Moines Register and Tribune; Mary McGrory, syndicated columnist for the Washington Star; and Richard Doak, political writer for the Des Moines Tribune. These are the ground rules for tonight's program. In the first part of the program, the panelists will question the candidates. The first question will go to Congressman Crane, and he will be given 2 minutes to answer. Then each of the other 5 candidates will be given 1 minute to respond or comment on that same question. The second question will go to Senator Baker, and the same pattern of reply and response will be followed. We will continue this process in turn around the table. The order in which the candidates are to be questioned was determined by a drawing. The panel question period will last 80 minutes. In the second part of the program, members of the audience will pose questions to the candidates. The audience question period will take 20 minutes. In the final part of the program, each candidate will make a closing statement with a 3-minute time limit. We will now begin the questioning from the panel. The first question is from Mr. Mears.
Congressman Crane, Republicans are becoming increasingly critical of the way President Carter is handling the hostage crisis in Iran. He has been accused of weakness, appeasement, and deception. You have said that the president has to assume total responsibility for the fact that it happened in the first place. My question is addressed not only to you, but to each of the candidates, and it is, what specific steps would you take if you were president tonight in order to get the American hostages returned home safely?
Walter, I think that you, every member of the press corps present, every person sitting in this vast audience tonight, and every person watching this program on television has his own answer to that question, as do every one of us here. Very frankly, I don't think it's appropriate for us to be speaking to specific solutions to that problem until, God willing, we have those hostages out alive, or God forbid they lay a hand on one of those hostages. I will say this: if any one of those Americans is in any way harmed, I think there must be some swift and very forceful retaliation from this country. But prior to that happening, and as I say, God willing, it's not going to happen, that they will be returned home safely, I myself have reserved judgment in a public way of what I feel should be done. I guarantee you I will be quite willing to amplify what I think should have been done and could have been done very early on after we get our people home safely.
Senator Baker.
Mr. Mears, in my view, the situation in Iran is a symptom. It's a symptom of a failed foreign policy by the Carter administration. I think the world has perceived the idea that we are weak and that we are unwilling to protect our vital interests, protect our diplomatic outposts, and our personnel. The only way that we can deal with a situation such as Iran effectively is to avoid it in the first instance, and to recreate the idea that America is still strong and still determined to protect her vital interests. I will not second-guess President Carter on how he should handle this crisis. I'll be perfectly pleased to discuss how to avoid future ones.
Congressman Anderson.
Mr. Mears, the precise question that you have put to us is, what would we do to get the hostages home? Obviously, the next step in this drama will take place when our representative will go before the Security Council of the United Nations on Monday after the failure of the mission of the Secretary General and seek at that time to get the Council to vote some meaningful economic sanctions. I think in addition to a trade embargo, and I believe it ought to be an embargo with teeth, we ought to also seek to cut off all telegraphic, cable traffic communications with Iran. They have behaved as an outlaw nation, and I think they ought to be treated as such.
Governor Connolly.
Mr. Mears, in early October, prior to the time that our embassy was seized and our diplomatic personnel taken as hostages, I recommended very strongly that the United States establish a military presence in the Middle East by putting air components in the airfields in the Sinai and establishing a Fifth Fleet out of components of the 6th and 7th and station them permanently in the Indian Ocean in order that we might have a military presence in the Middle East to provide security for that area and economic stability for that area. That obviously was not done. I think it still should be done. That in itself would not necessarily secure the release of the hostages, but it would surely have put us in a position to where if indeed there were options that could have been taken, we would have been in a position to take them. Our people are hostage because we've shown weakness and appeasement over the many months and over the last several years, and it'll continue to be so.
Senator Dole.
Mr. Mears, it seems to me that first we must understand that they're not hostages, they're prisoners of war. The taking of our embassy was an act of aggression, an act of war. The Americans are there, whether it's 43 or 50, are prisoners of war. I would suggest, I have public in the past 2 weeks, certainly I support the President. I support the hostages or the prisoners of war through the President. But I would hope that on Monday, on the 7th, that we will be prepared to announce publicly that we will impose an embargo of everything except emergency medical supplies going into Iran. And that would be shutting off oil coming out of Iran. We would make that statement publicly, and we'll do it on a unilateral basis if the Security Council refuses to act. That would put the pressure on those in charge in Iran. It would indicate to the Americans and to the world that we're determined to pursue it.
Ambassador Bush.
Mr. Mears, I support the President. I don't want to say anything that even peripherally could endanger or complicate the lives of the hostages there. I have been talking incessantly for the last year about strength in foreign policy. I support the multilateral efforts that the President is making in trying to mobilize the UN, but as a former ambassador there, I am not overly optimistic about the UN taking the kind of concerted effort that it can take under the Charter. As the President indicates, a certain escalation and tightening of things in relation to the hostage situation, I'll support him.
Our second question is from Mr. Anthem to Senator Baker.
Senator Baker, you along with several other of the candidates here have expressed opposition to President Carter's action embargoing grain shipments to the Soviet Union in response to their move into Afghanistan. Why is a grain embargo not acceptable to you as an expression of American disapproval? And what would you do now in response to this situation? Would you, for example, send your proposed 50,000-man 1st Brigade force into Afghanistan?
Mr. Anthony, the Afghanistan situation is similar to the Iranian situation in some respects, and far more similar, I suppose, to the situation in the South Yemen, in Cuba, in Angola, in other places where there has been the evidence of an adventuristic Russian foreign policy, of a Soviet foreign policy. Deterrence is the key word. I do not believe that after the crisis has begun that you have nearly the range of options that you have to deter it in the first instance. The President has available to him only a few things now short of outright warfare. A number of measures such as embargoes of technical equipment I will support. But on yesterday I advised the President through Dr. Brzezinski that I would not support, I do not support an embargo of foodstuffs to the Soviet Union. I think foodstuffs are not a useful and appropriate tool of the foreign policy of this nation. I think we almost always starve the wrong people. I doubt that we will ever even inconvenience the leaders of the Soviet Union and the Kremlin. I think that the only people who will be severely injured will be the American agricultural community. I think in a way, to embargo the shipment of food to the Soviet Union is very similar to the very things we criticized in Cambodia, where the starvation of a whole population there was threatened by the political decisions of two communist regimes. Now, the question of what I would do if I were president would state once again that America is strong enough to protect our vital interests and try to assemble the disincentives for the Soviet Union to have future Afghanistans, future Irans, future South Yemens that will threaten our security. The 1st Brigade concept would be useful only for the purpose of the specialized protection of American nationals, American embassies, American hostages, wherever they would occur. It is not suitable for a massive military intervention in another country.
Congressman Anderson, your response?
Again, and I disagree with Senator Baker. It's not easy sitting here in the heart of Iowa in farm country to support an embargo on the shipment of grain. But it seems to me that it is passing strange that those who are critical of our foreign policy as being deficient on the grounds that it is weak, when the first real test comes of responding to the kind of overt aggression that has just been taken by the Soviet Union against Afghanistan, are unwilling to accept any measure of sacrifice, to accept some of the cost that admittedly has to be borne if we are going to send a clear, certain signal to the Russians that we will not tolerate the kind of conduct that they have just engaged in Afghanistan. I don't think that a rapid deployment force is the right answer. I think it's the wrong response. It seems to me that the lesson of what happened in Iran, what is happening in the Middle East, is that we have got to become less dependent on our imports of foreign oil.
Governor Connolly.
Well, first, I don't think the Iowa farmers should pay the price for the failure of the Carter foreign policy. That's number one. Secondly, unless the President has a specific agreement with Canada, Australia, and Argentina that they're not going to rush in and fill the void that we're leaving by the failure to sell 17 million metric tons of grain to the Soviet Union, then I think the President's made a mistake. If he has indeed that kind of an agreement, if indeed he is prepared to embargo technology, sophisticated equipment of all kinds and character to go along with the embargo of grain shipments to the Soviet Union, then I think it makes some sense, because ultimately we're going to have to put economic pressure on the Soviet Union, and they've clearly shown that they're not able to produce the food and fiber that they need for their own people, and that's why they've been buying these huge shipments of grain from the United States.
Senator Dole.
In Des Moines, Iowa, on August 25th, 1976, candidate Carter said, "Every time Nixon, Ford, and Butz have imposed a new export embargo, it has caused permanent damage to foreign markets for farm products." He did that last night. He devastated the American farmer. He made the farmer the scapegoat for past failures in foreign policy. It didn't hurt the Russians a bit. He took a poke at the Russian bear and knocked out the American farmer. Now, I would just suggest if we do anything, we ought to take this 17 million tons, or a big portion of it, and ship it to Cambodia, where people are starving without any focus being laid to them by the Carter administration. let's don't pick out the farmer and single out the farmer for all this special treatment. The taxpayer will suffer and the consumer will suffer in the long run.
Ambassador Bush.
Well, in my view, the president made the wrong mistake, as Yogi Berra would say. It's fine to talk about sacrifice, but if we're going to talk about sacrifice, you don't ask one segment of the economy to sacrifice, and you don't impose a program that hurts us more than it does them. Our agricultural exports make a significant contribution to our abysmal showing on balance of payments. So I disapprove of the president's action.
Congressman Crane.
I am willing to single out one portion of our economy for special treatment, and those are the people who produce the high technology and strategic items that we have been exporting to the Soviet Union and which I have opposed exporting to the Soviet Union consistently. I was critical of President Ford when he initiated an embargo against grain sales, as I've been critical of President Carter for doing the same thing. The last thing in the world, it seems to me, we should embargo is the exportation of food. It permits a diversion of their scarce resources from the purchase of military hardware and military adventures into consumer items that are going to be not used in a military way. And for that reason, I think the farmer has been made a scapegoat again of the consistent foreign policy failures of this administration.
Our next question is from Ms. McGrory to Congressman Anderson.
Congressman Anderson, you claim to be the only genuine moderate, the only Republican who can attract Democratic voters in the fall. Why do you think that none of your rivals, present and absent, are acceptable to the Democrats? And also, what makes you think you can win Republican voters in the spring in the primaries when your party is tilting so far to the right?
Well, I think the last part of your question is perhaps the one that I should answer first. Republicans, conservative Republicans, by definition, I think, ought to be pragmatic enough to realize, Ms. McGrory, that they are about 1 out of 4 of the eligible voters in this country today. And 24, 25%, 51% doth not make. I believe that if the Republican Party is going to win the general election in 1980, it simply is going to have to be coalition-minded. It's going to have to realize the necessity of attracting the independent voters in this country, which today by some 10 or 12% outnumber Republicans. I think there are a great many discerning and disaffected Democrats in this country who are looking for a candidate who demonstrates that he is compassionate on the social issues, on the social questions, that he is progressive and forward-looking on issues of that kind, and yet can combine with it a frugality, a prudence, when it comes to the role of the government, particularly in fiscal matters, so that once again we can begin to bring this country back to some semblance of economic stability. And I believe, on the basis of a career in Congress that now is in its 20th year, that I, better than any of my opponents in this race, can demonstrate that over many years I've been in the forefront of the battle on civil rights. It was my vote that was the deciding vote on open housing in 1968, and I've been associated with every single important civil rights bill for the last decade and a half. And yet, when it comes to economic issues, when it comes to the necessity of reducing federal expenditures, I do believe that I have demonstrated with my voting record the kind of concern over the role of the federal government in that regard that will hold the Republican vote and bring with it the independent and democratic vote that we need for a victory.
Thank you. It's now Governor Connolly's time for response.
I don't think we should be overly impressed by registration statistics about how many people call themselves Democrats, how many Republicans, and how many independents. I think clearly what's important in the country today is the philosophy of the candidates, and I don't think there's any doubt, there's none in my mind, but what the majority of the people in this country would classify themselves philosophically as moderate to conservative. I think people are fed up with big government, big spending, big deficits, big bureaucracy, a lack of attention to the development of an energy policy, the deteriorating dollar, printing of money, and all that goes with it. And I don't think any of these these particular matters carry any particular label, except they obviously violate every good sense that Americans have. And so I think any of us who adopt a moderate to conservative viewpoint have an excellent chance to convince the Democrats and convince independents that indeed they should support us.
Senator Dole?
Well, first let me compliment John Anderson, because we started together in the House, and we both pretty much traveled the same direction. He went off a bit to the left, and I veered off a bit to the right, and I got back in the middle, and he's trying to get back to the middle. So, but I would just suggest that we need to change the perception of our party. You know, we've got to attract more people. And I believe my record will demonstrate that. John Anderson talked about his 19 years, and I came the same day he did. We've got to attract black Americans, Hispanic Americans, senior citizens who've looked the other way to our party. We've got to have a health care program. We've got to have a food stamp program and disability benefits. We've got to recognize the responsibility of the federal government. I think I've done that. My record says that. Just examine my record.
Ambassador Bush.
Well, I am one who has continually spoken out against trying to label people. I happen to believe our party is closer together today than it has been in a long, long time. I happen to believe that the lack of compassion comes from those who overpromise and break people by inflation and see a decline in every standard of living that everyone adheres to. And so I am one who believes that people are going to be looking, yes, for compassion, but for some new answers that we haven't tried in the 60s and the 70s. And I'll be candid with you, I don't believe being in Congress all the time is the answer. I was there long enough to know how it works, but not to be part of the problem, in my view.
Congressman Crane.
I think our liberal friends have historically been guilty of a problem defined by Justice Brandeis once when he said they were people well-intentioned but without understanding. And it is their social concerns that have created the massive deficits, which have in turn created the massive levels of inflation, which have plundered savings, which have virtually wiped out many of the elderly, and have denied opportunity to those in the lowest income brackets. I think the message that we've been preaching as a Republican Party involves opportunity, it involves upward mobility, it involves progress. That's the message that provides the foundation for building a new coalition in this country, a new Republican majority.
Senator Baker.
Sometimes there's an advantage to being the last man, but for the life of me, I can't think of a single one at this point. All of these men are my friends. But you know, there's an old saying, it's got to be one of us, and I was as soon it was me as anybody I know. But my claim for the nomination, Ms. McGrory, is based on my track record. You know, the name of the game is not to get nominated. The name of the game is to get elected. And I claim a track record. Since 1972, I've been elected twice in statewide races in a Democratic state in Tennessee. We know we're a minority party. Republicans do. But I sometimes think Democrats forget they are a minority party, too. And the man or the woman who will win the presidency from this time forward will be the one who proposes useful public policies. And I believe I can do that effectively and successfully in the campaign in 1980.
Our next question is from Richard Doak to Governor Connolly.
Governor Connolly, Ronald Reagan is the front runner for the nomination. Tell us how you differ with Governor Reagan on any important issue, and what makes you more deserving of the nomination.
Well, first, you asked me a question that really I can't answer. I wish Governor Reagan was here. Oh, how I wish he was here. You know, I really don't know how he stands on the issues. I must say to you, I read, I watch, I listen, but I don't hear much. I don't see much. If he was here, I would be delighted to compare notes with him, and I've challenged him actually to travel with me around the country on the same platform, so that I could get some inkling of really what he does believe and how he would handle some of these issues, but to no avail. I think he has other ideas about how he wants to run, if indeed he's running, and I think he is. Now, I can only tell you how I feel about various issues, and I'll be delighted to do it. I, for instance, have been quite specific and categorical in my response to what kind of an energy policy I would propose for the United States. I would mine more coal and burn more coal, and I'd open up more public lands for exploration for oil and gas, and I'd build more nuclear power plants. The last time I heard Governor Reagan speak on the subject, he, according to the press, he said that he would get the government off of the backs of private enterprise and let them do their job. That's fine, and as a broad matter of principle, I think that sounds good, but I don't know whether that means he's for nuclear power or against it, or whether he'd mine more coal, or what he's for. So I must say to you in all seriousness, I don't know. Why do I think I'm entitled to the nomination? I don't think I'm entitled to it, and I don't think he's entitled to it. I don't think it's a reward. I think we ought to get out and fight for it, and I think he ought to be here debating with us tonight to prove that he's worthy of it.
Thank you. I would like to ask the audience to please refrain from applause. Senator Dole.
The same question?
You have the question, Senator. You can give any answer you choose.
Well, I wanted to correct George Bush that he wasn't part of the problem. He tried to be part of the problem, but he lost that Senate race in Texas. And I want to say to Governor Reagan, wherever you are, I hope you're having fun tonight, because we are. And if you're looking for a younger Ronald Reagan with experience, I'm here.
Is that it?
Ambassador Bush?
Well, it's a wonderful thing. We're getting down to a little more the core here, but when you lose, it doesn't hurt. Abraham Lincoln wasn't hurt by it. And look at the experience I've had in foreign affairs, being your ambassador in China, your ambassador in the United Nations, running the Central Intelligence Agency, being head of this party on a full-time basis. And so I would emphasize, in answer to the question, that the breadth of experience I've had and the conviction I have in foreign affairs and domestic affairs and building a business, I believe the only candidate here that did that, met a payroll, I believe those things are very important. We may be together, closer together as Republican candidates on issues, but that's good, not bad, because we need to beat Democrats in the fall. That's the way I'd answer it.
Congressman Crane.
I think the least qualified Republican in the race is infinitely superior to the alternatives. Secondly, on the question of differences with Ronald Reagan, I confess that I served as a surrogate for Ronald Reagan. I was the second member of Congress to support him in the 1976 race before he'd even declare. The only substantive area of disagreement I know I have with him is that he accepts parity or rough equivalency in strategic weapons with the Soviet Union. I reject that. I believe in military superiority and think it's absolutely essential for this country to regain military superiority. I think my background as a historian and as a man who has served in Congress for better than a decade gives me unique qualifications for this office and the ability to assume the responsibilities.
Senator Baker.
I think Ronald Reagan was a good governor of California. I think he's a worthy contender for the Republican presidential nomination. I think that there's a good likelihood that the outcome of that challenge will occur here in the state of Iowa. I think if people in Iowa turn out in massive numbers for the caucuses on January 21st, there's a good chance that this very exchange of ideas here tonight will establish those differences in our ability to get elected, and the preference of the party for something new, a forward-looking policy. And I believe any one of us here to compete tonight have a superior claim to Governor Reagan for that opportunity.
Congressman Anderson.
Well, I think that perhaps the real reason that Mr. Reagan is not here tonight is that he's been running for president for about 15 years now, and he really doesn't have anything much different to say tonight than he did back in 1964 or 68 or any of the other occasions on which he was an unsuccessful candidate. And I must confess to this audience that I am not a younger Ronald Reagan with experience. I am younger, yes, but I do not share his view of the world. He was opposed to the SALT II agreement even before the invasion of Afghanistan. He was opposed to the Panama Canal treaties. He takes a view of the economy that I think pretty much goes back to the time of Adam Smith and the invisible hand. He doesn't see a genuine role for the federal government when it comes to advancing the cause of human rights or civil rights in this country. And I think really most of his ideas would take us back at least as long as he has been a candidate for that office himself.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mr. Mears to Senator Dole.
Senator, you have remarked that all the candidates here seem to be for pretty much the same things. You said you haven't found a single one who favors inflation. You said that everyone is for a strong defense and that everyone favors a balanced budget. You might have added that virtually everyone advocates a tax cut. How can any president curb inflation, cut taxes, increase defense spending, and balance the budget all at the same time?
It's going to be difficult. And that's why I think we must very carefully choose the right candidate. And I have someone in mind. Someone with experience, someone who serves as a ranking Republican on the Finance Committee that deals with taxes, Social Security, health care, welfare reform, energy, beef imports, sugar legislation, international trade, and someone who has ideas about how we do this. I'm not one of those Republicans advocating an across-the-board tax cut. There will be tax cuts in 1980. We ought to address capital formation. We ought to exclude from taxes interest and dividend income. In fact, that's an amendment I offered to the windfall profits tax, and it was accepted. We ought to make certain that we increase productivity in this country. We ought to do it with a tax credit for workers who increase their productivity. We ought to stop inflation with a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget. And I proposed such an amendment and have fought very hard for such an amendment. There are ways to do it. We need to look at our tax structure. We need to look at the American people. There will be a tax cut in 1980. But it seems to me that it ought to be focused on generating capital, on capital formation, on creating new jobs, and to do that very honestly and most sincerely. We need someone who's been on the firing line every day this year, every day last year, every day over the years, and who understands the system and who can work with his colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, and make it work.
Ambassador Bush.
It sounds complicated, but it isn't all that complicated. When Gerald Ford came into office, inflation was 12%. When he left, by vetoing legislation that broke his budget, it was 4.8. How do you do it? In 45 seconds left. One, you limit the growth of federal spending, holding it carefully below the rate of inflation. Second, you get these regulators to make some sense. We are regulating ourselves into non-productivity. We have too much regulation. And the third thing you do, you mentioned a tax cut, have one. But I don't support an across-the-board tax cut. I support one that's a supply-side one. Every facet of it determined to increase investment. And if we do those three things, you can. That formula encompasses an increase in defense spending. We have a tremendously productive revenue side. We have a $2.3 trillion economy. It can work.
Congressman Crane.
I introduced in the last Congress and again in this Congress a constitutional amendment that fixes the percentage of our national income the federal government can spend at what it is today, What this does is establish a linkage in growth in federal spending to growth in personal and national income. This has the added advantage of guaranteeing a balanced budget within 2 years without increasing taxes. Once you have the books in balance, you've eliminated the source of inflation. It is monetizing debt with printing press money to pay off those deficits. And once you've eliminated that, you've created a climate once more for saving, capital formation, and investment. I do support Jack Kemp's 30% bracket reduction in taxation over the next 3 years, and I think by rearranging the priorities within the budget, you can increase defense spending without savaging existing programs. You may have to hold down or restrain the growth of them over the next few years, but you can increase defense spending within those limitations.
Senator Baker.
There are two things. The first is we've got to get over the temptation to think that we have no growth before us. I believe in growth. And I believe that we've got to reiterate our belief that we can create new wealth. We do that through a combination of tax changes that are essential to increase productivity, to increase the tax base, to increase the revenues that are available for all of the things that Mr. Mears suggested. The second thing we do is to restrain the rate of growth of federal spending. The federal government is the biggest cause of inflation in this country. And I believe, as Gerald Ford showed and demonstrated in his short tenure as president, that you can put that animal of inflation back in the cage if you've got the courage, if you'll do the things that are tough and necessary to bring federal spending under control. A bigger pie for bigger slices, a smaller rate of growth in federal spending.
Congressman Anderson.
How do you balance the budget, cut taxes, and increase defense spending at the same time? It's very simple. You do it with mirrors. And that's what it would take. I don't recommend a general tax cut in 1980. Given the situation in the country today, given the very real prospect of recession in 1980, with the impact that that will have on receipts and expenditures of the federal government, I think it's irresponsible to call for a 33 1/3% tax cut. I would put an emergency excise tax on gasoline, and then I would recycle that to the wage earners of this country. Give them, in effect, the biggest tax cut in history, $46 billion, by cutting their Social Security tax in half. That's the way to help the wage earners of this country. And then as far as federal spending is concerned, not a constitutional amendment, but a statute limiting federal spending to a fixed percentage of our gross national product.
Governor Connolly.
How do you balance the budget, increase defense spending, have a general tax cut? You don't do it with mirrors. You do it by electing Republicans to Congress so we can control both houses of Congress. That's the only way I know to do it. It can be done. President Carter in January said to the Congress of the United States that over the next 4 fiscal years, he anticipated the revenue coming to the federal government would exceed the present level of expenditures by almost $250 billion. Almost $250 billion more in revenue than the present level of spending. Slow the rate of federal spending, balance this budget, veto and any appropriation bill in excess of anticipated revenues, cut this bureaucracy, exempt most small businesses from 90% of all the rules and regulations imposed by the bureaucracy today, develop an energy program to meet the needs of this nation from domestic sources, and you can get a tax cut.
Our next question is from Mr. Anthony to Ambassador Bush.
Ambassador Bush, the trend in American agriculture is toward fewer and bigger farms, toward increasing control by absentee landowners and by non-farm interests, and toward greater involvement by agribusiness corporations. Does this trend concern you? And if so, what specific remedies would you propose?
It concerns me because I believe strongly in the family farm, but sometimes the problem is overstated. Sometimes it is made to believe that people are made to believe that outside interests control too much. I favor a strong monitoring to be sure that there isn't too much. But the main thing we ought to do is be sure that you have equitable taxation. Farmers here pay capital gains on the disposal of their land at profit. People from abroad that own land in this country don't. So I would favor equity. I do believe that it's proper that the states control as much as possible the amount of foreign farm ownership. there's a principle, and every farmer here understands it, that you want to sell abroad or invest abroad, you better permit people to invest here. But I think careful monitoring to see that the family farm is not obliterated by takeover from abroad. But I don't favor restricting the family farm so a family farm with more efficiency, more ability on the part of its manager, the owner, can't take over land next to it. I don't favor that at all. So I think you ought to just closely watch it. I'd like as much control in policy on this, incidentally, set at the state level as opposed to the federal level.
Congressman Crane.
I've introduced legislation that, in my judgment, addresses one of the principal concerns with regard to the breakup of the family farm, and that is to eliminate inheritance and gift taxes altogether. So many of my liberal friends who express concern over the loss of the family farm are the ones who, after a man has worked all his life and paid taxes right up to that ungracious moment he dies, then come in and clobber his loved ones by forcing them to sell off the farm to agribusiness as a means of paying off the inheritance taxes. And the revenue lost this year, had we done that, is less than $6 billion. And Mr. Califano told us earlier last year that he poured better than $7 billion down a rat hole out of his HEW budget alone. So this is not unrealistic nor impractical. Indexing capital gains is another ingredient. Accelerating depreciation allowances to get them in conformity with the major industrial nations of the world is another ingredient. And no embargoes on the exportation of American grain unless we embargo all exports.
Senator Baker.
You know, small business ought to be the backbone of the Republican strength in this country, because I think one of the most fundamental tenets of our political belief is that individual Americans have the right to prosper according to their own effort. And the family farm is a prime example of how that has worked in the past, and it's in danger. And I think a whole range of actions are necessary with the federal government in the tax field and otherwise to make sure that the family farm concept is not destroyed. Speaking as we were a moment ago of the proposed grain embargo of sales to the Soviet Union by President Carter, the family farm, more than any other group, would be devastated by such an action if, in fact, it is carried out. I think such an action, the embargo of grain sales to Russia, is inhumane. I think it's inappropriate to our foreign policy. I think it would be destructive to the family farm in this country.
Congressman Anderson.
I will certainly support any necessary changes in existing farm legislation that will make sure family farms are not wiped out because of the grain embargo. As you know, there was no set-aside provided for in 1980, and as a result, the Secretary does not have the authority under the law currently to raise target prices. I will promptly introduce and support legislation that would raise those target prices on both wheat, corn, and feed grains so that the family farmer need not worry that because of the embargo he's going to be wiped out. In addition to that, I would firmly be in favor of appropriations to buy up as much grain as we can to proceed with the manufacture of gasohol as an additive to our present fuel supply. I think we can turn this whole situation into one of advantage as far as trying to find a better solution to the energy problem.
Governor Connolly.
I think we have to recognize where the problem really is. It's not foreign ownership. Less than 1% of the farmland of this country is owned by foreigners. The efficiency of the family farm clearly is able to compete with the large corporate farm organizations. The real problem is a lack of understanding of what contribution the American farmer makes to this economy. This year we will export $32 billion worth of agricultural commodities. This will be an all-time high. The sale of agricultural commodities in the marketplaces of the world will contribute $18 to $20 billion surplus to the balance of trade in this country. Nothing is as efficient. Nothing contributes as much to the balance of payments as does the sale of agricultural commodities. What we have to do is to keep in mind that farmers are entitled to make a profit like everybody else. They're so efficient that 20 years ago, it took 24% of the disposable income of the average American working family to feed his family, 24% of his disposable income. That figure today has declined to 17% of the disposable income, and yet the farmer still gets it in the neck.
Senator Dole.
You put a man in the White House who understands agriculture. That's how you do it. I know about the 125,000 farms in Iowa. I know you're the #1 hog state, the #2 corn state, sometimes #1, #3 soybean state. It was my amendment to repeal carryover basis. It was my amendment to make foreigners who buy land pay a capital gains tax. My fingerprints on every farm bill that passed the Congress in the past 19 years. I was on the House Committee 8 years. I'm the second-ranking Republican on the Senate Ag Committee. I understand agriculture. I grew up in a farm town. And it just seems to me that what we need is a steady voice in the White House who talks about the American farmer and the family farm. I was on the Family Farm Subcommittee in the House. We only met once in 8 years. So don't listen to all this talk about family farms. You've got to go out and work for it. You've got to demonstrate the need to keep the farmer on the farm to feed the American people, and they have the best bargain in the world.
Our next question is from Ms. McGrory to Congressman Crane.
Congressman Crane, last Sunday night on 60 Minutes, Governor Connolly said that if he had it to do over again, he would not say what he said at the time of the death of Martin Luther King. Could you tell us in that same spirit, is there anything in your public career that you regret, that you'd take back or do differently if you had the chance?
Mary, I am a fallible mortal. And as such, yes, there are many things that I've said, as we all have, without thinking and reflecting properly, that we'd like to take back. I've hurt my wife, I've hurt my children, I've hurt my parents, and I apologize to each and every one of them. I will tell you one thing, though, that in public life, as in debates when I was teaching on the university campus, I never ever questioned an opponent's sincerity or his integrity or his motives. And it seems to me that we can have a very healthy and exciting debate, which is an essential ingredient of the democratic process when we confine our discussions to issues. I don't think issues, as one candidate in this race has suggested, not present tonight, I don't think they're divisive. After all, you know, I went out and did it for him in '76, and I argued that same point in '76, that if we keep our discussion to issues, how can anyone have any hard feelings? John here and I probably have disagreed more in the House on issues through the years. I have never once ever questioned John's integrity, nor his sincerity, nor his commitment to what he believes, and John and I probably disagree on more than any other two people up here. But for all of that, I have enormous respect and admiration for John's talents and his abilities. And as I say, when you keep debates within that context, there is no reason for anyone to ever have his nose out of joint. We can walk away as good friends from this, and you people out there who have to make the decisions as to which one of us you want to represent you, you make that on the basis of issues. And that, as I said, is called small d democracy, and that's going to elect a Republican president in 1980.
Senator Baker.
Mary, my life is littered with things that I wish I could do over again, or things I wish I could say in a different way. But I expect that's a useful and normal human reaction. All of us have a different perspective on different issues from time to time. But I think in looking back on my total experience in public life, that there's one thing that I am at peace with. And that is, even in those cases where I may have a different view now, I'm absolutely convinced that when I made the judgment in public life, that it was made on the basis of the best judgment I could make, as the Lord gave me the talent to do it. I've done that in every case that has ever appeared before me, in the international arena, in terms of the Panama Canal vote or my opposition to SALT, in terms of civil rights legislation that I've supported in the Congress, to other measures. Sometimes you have a different view at different times, but I'm convinced that in every case I did what I thought was right, and I continue to believe that in every major case I can think of.
Congressman Anderson.
Well, I almost think that I ought to take my 60 seconds to spend my time to extol the virtues of my friend on my right. And I could do that because I do reciprocate the sentiments that he expressed. But I suppose as I look back over a career in the Congress and the thousands of votes that have been cast during that time, if I had one that I could change, it would have been the vote that I cast in favor of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1965. The vote that later was to be interpreted, and I think incorrectly, but nevertheless so interpreted by Mr. Katzenbach, as a functional declaration of war that led us down the road to Vietnam with all of the divisiveness that that brought. And I hope maybe in the critical hour that we are now in, all of us will have learned some lessons from that experience and be careful with respect to the kind of course that we chart in the months ahead.
Governor Connolly.
Any political regrets? No, I believe not. I supported President Ford in 1976. Beyond that, sure. I wish I'd been smarter sooner. I waited too long to convert. But I was under the misapprehension that if you did, the lightning would roll and thunder would flash and anything might happen. But when I went into that booth and pulled that curtain and pulled that lever, and as I opened that curtain and stepped out, lightning didn't flash and thunder didn't roll, I felt cleansed and purified.
Senator Dole.
Well, in preparing for this debate, I read some of Mary's columns. If you'll take back what you've said about me, I'll take back anything. But well, I said earlier tonight I was going to be seated between two of the richest men in America. And I said that in a complimentary way, and I'm proud to be here with this class. But so I take back everything I've ever said about anybody in politics, and we'll start over tomorrow. But I think very seriously that we do say things in the heat of battle or the heat of the debate, maybe not this debate so far. But I find most people in politics, men or women, Republicans or Democrats, sincere and honest people, concerned about America, concerned about our future. And if I've ever offended anyone, I once called Carter Chicken Fried McGovern. And I take that back because I've come to respect McGovern.
Ambassador Bush.
Well, I'm sure everybody is fallible, everybody has made mistakes, but on a serious note, on a question that is tough to answer, I think the answer, Mary, lies in recognizing one's own shortcomings and attracting men and women of excellence to help you do the important job, in this case, of the presidency. And everyone's going to make mistakes. There's no question about it. But I made that reference to Yogi Berra, and you may remember the context. He'd lost 20 straight, and they said, "What went wrong?" And he said, "We made the wrong mistakes." Now, what you want to do is avoid making mistakes that you shouldn't make. And the way you do that is to be assisted in running things by having quality, class, if you will, excellence around you. That's the way I would try to correct for my fallibility.
Our next question is from Mr. Doak to Senator Baker.
Senator Baker, in the past, Americans often have felt their nation had a special mission or a special destiny in the world. Does America now have such a mission, and how would you define it?
Well, I don't think there's a single issue in this campaign that's likely to be ventilated, to be discussed by any candidate in our party or the Democratic Party, more important than the issue of whether or not America's future is still before it, or our time of greatness is still before us. I believe it is. I believe we've just barely glimpsed the greatness of this nation and our ability to remain strong and resolute in the protection of our vital interests, and our ability to create new wealth at such an astonishing rate through the free enterprise system that we can eliminate at least abject poverty from the face of this nation. I believe that we can accomplish social goals and fulfill social ambitions that we've never even dared to dream of if we harness the genius of the American political system, our economic system, and if we survive the threat from abroad. I truly believe that America still has a great mission in this world. And our mission is not only to perform for the welfare of American citizens, but as in the past, to provide an example for the rest of the world to follow, to emulate, to aspire to the status of our accomplishment. I believe in America. I believe that we still have before us an opportunity to do things that no nation has ever dared to dream of. And I believe this election in 1980 may very well be a crossroads time in America's history when we decide such things as whether or not we have the will and the determination to stay strong, whether we can, in fact, reiterate our belief in ourselves and the free enterprise system, whether we believe in small business and individual human beings, or whether we believe in the composite and the total of the community. I believe that America's mission in life is to further demonstrate the vitality, the viability, and the greatness of the American dream. And I believe we should discuss that in this campaign in 1980.
Congressman Anderson.
Oh, yes, indeed. I think this country has a great and a special mission. I think we have to continue to offer the same hope and the same opportunity that we have offered to those millions of Americans who came to these shores, including my own immigrant father at the very beginning of the present century. We are still, in the words of a great American historian, C. Vann Woodward, we are the great American experiment. And I believe it's in the power, within the power of everyone in this room, within the sound of my voice tonight, in playing a part, in having a role, in proving that this country is still great, not in the sense that we are overbearing, but in the sense that we are willing, humbly, and even sacrificially, to do those things that will create the climate and build a better and a more peaceful world.
Governor Connolly.
Yes, indeed. I believe the United States does have a special mission and a special destiny. I think the nation, from the time it was founded, carries with it God's blessings, and I think the mission is even more pronounced today than it's ever been in a 200-year history. I think we're the hope of freedom in this world. I think that the United States means to Americans and to all who aspire to freedom throughout the world a special challenge, a special opportunity to see the lives of people enriched, to be sure that the oppressive hand of government is limited, and to see that human freedoms are expanded. That's the mission, and that's the destiny of the United States.
Senator Dole.
Our mission is one of peace and hope. Peace in the world and hope for all those who live in the free world and others. To feed and clothe the starving and the hungry, and there are many, and Iowa set an example for that. Beyond that, this is the International Year of the Disabled. You know, there are 40 million in this country. There are millions around the world. I would hope we would focus this year on the needs of these Americans and these people who live around the world. We've always met the challenge. We've always been up to the task, whether it's a Food for Peace program, which meant $30-some billion to help hungry people around the world. We meet our responsibilities. We are a great nation, and we're great because of the people in it, the people in my state of Kansas, and the people in the state of Iowa, and all across the country.
Ambassador Bush.
Well, because of our wealth, because of our productivity, because of our political system, because of what de Tocqueville found when he looked at the United States and he saw the propensity of one American to help another, because of all of these things, we have a special destiny. And because of them, we have a special destiny not just here in this country, but around the world. We are, in a troubled world, the only credible deterrent to the Soviet Union. And so we have a tremendous responsibility to those countries that want to be free, some communist countries that want to move away from the Soviet domination. We have a responsibility at home to fulfill that destiny, and we have a responsibility abroad to fulfill that destiny.
Congressman Crane.
George mentioned the great French philosopher de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville, in traveling America back in the 1830s, looked for the secret to American greatness, and he said he looked in the rural areas, he looked in the cities, and then finally he entered our churches, and he said he found the churches were aflame with righteousness, and he said then he found the secret to American genius and power. America was great, he said, because America was good, and America would continue to remain great so long as America continued to remain good. We happen to be the most decent, compassionate, generous, humane, and free people who have ever walked the face of this earth. That is our special mission, our special destiny. There is no country in the history of civilization that has performed what America has managed to do, and we have the obligation with each generation to guarantee that we perpetuate that for those unborn generations in the future.
Our next question is from Mr. Mears to Congressman Anderson.
Congressman Anderson, you advocate a 50-cent-a-gallon gasoline tax to cut consumption and reduce oil imports, with the revenues, as you mentioned, to be used to reduce Social Security taxes. That's quite similar to a proposal that President Carter considered and dropped after the leaders of Congress told him that they couldn't possibly get it passed. How could you, as a Republican president, get such a tax enacted? And more generally, what can a new Republican president do about energy that hasn't already been tried by Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Carter?
Well, I think there are a lot of things, Walter, that a Republican president can do that have not been tried. First of all, he can give this country a clear, consistent, common sense energy policy. This administration has failed now for 3 years to do. Now, with reference to the 50-cent-a-gallon tax that I proposed, an emergency excise tax, I think this is a clear example of a situation where if the president had provided the kind of leadership that he could, following the Iranian crisis that began on the 4th of November, he could have called on the American people for some sacrifice in order to relieve our dependence on imported oil. The whole lesson of Iran ought to be, the whole question of the Middle East and our future is bound up with the question of our continued dependence to the extent of almost 43 or 44% on importing foreign oil, much of it from the Middle East. And I think the president lost a golden opportunity in that particular situation. He could have called on the American people at that time, and I think they would have been willing to come forth with a measure of sacrifice that would have required. Now, actually, the offset that I have prescribed or offered in the way of a 50% cut in Social Security taxes means that for the average worker in this country today, he would get a $600 tax cut, $626 to be exact, in 1980 if it became effective this year. And that would offset about 18 or 20,000 miles of driving. But I think a lot of workers in this country, if they had that $600 reduction in Social Security taxes, would find with typical Yankee ingenuity and resourcefulness that there were ways and means that they had to cut down on some of the usual driving that they have been doing so that they could spend that money for other purposes, for recreation, for food and clothing and so on. I think once the program is explained, it can get support in the Congress.
Governor Conley.
How would I get enacted a 50-cent-a-gallon tax? I wouldn't try. I think it's a mistake. I don't know of anything that'd be more oppressive to the working people of this country, the poor people of this country. I wouldn't even think about it. What can a Republican president do that hadn't been tried? I think we need a simplified program recognizing the facts of life, and a Republican president's going to have to do what anyone else does. He has to go to the American people, explain it very simply, and say to them that solar energy, geothermal, fusion, fast breeder reactor, all of these things are in the future. Wind, wave action, and so forth. They're in the future. What we're going to have to deal with for the next 15 to 20 years is very simply stated. We have to mine more coal and burn more coal and explore for and develop more oil and gas and build more nuclear power plants. Just that simple. He has to make an issue of it, and frankly, he has to get the support of the American people to override a recalcitrant Congress that has for 7 years now done nothing but make energy a political football to the detriment of this nation.
Senator Dole.
Well, with reference to the 50-cent gas tax, I just don't think there are enough members retiring or enough members of Congress who want to retire to pass that legislation. And so I would say the chances for that happening are next to nothing. But beyond that, we have great opportunities. I'm the ranking Republican on the Finance Committee. I was the manager of the so-called windfall profits tax bill on the floor. We have $30 billion in that proposal for tax credits for conservation to business and individuals. We have production credits for shale oil, for gasohol, for geothermal. We can produce our way out of this crisis if we get off the backs of some of those who are in the production business. And it seems to me the last thing we do is impose a very heavy tax on the individual. We can do it through conservation, through tax credits, through production, with tax credits. And we can't take all the money away from the oil companies and say, then go out and produce more energy.
Ambassador Bush.
I oppose the 50-cent gallon tax. I have heard programs where you're going to raise all this taxes and then you're going to give it back out of the other hand. I don't believe it. I don't believe that that's what we need. As prices have gone up, conservation is taking place. What do I favor? I favor less control. I favor decontrol. I favor shifting to alternative sources. I would support a windfall profits tax, but only if it were coupled with a plowback provision. I don't want to see more government in the energy business. And I agree we need to use the tax system to encourage conservation and to encourage increases in alternate sources of production. And lastly, I believe in mobilizing the free world, the best minds in the free world for research in terms of the out-year use of solar. But until then, we must go forward with alternate sources, synthetics, coal, nuclear, whatever it may be.
Congressman Crane.
President Carter proposed a 50-cent a gallon tax on gas back in 1977, and his own spokesman before our Ways and Means Committee testified that this would have an inconsequential impact on consumption if we were to assess that kind of tax. So it was concluded by the committee and by the Carter administration both that it was self-defeating. Europeans have been paying $2 and $3 a gallon for gasoline for years, and they still drive. I think the answer is immediate and total deregulation, no so-called windfall profits taxes. They are in fact excise taxes, not windfall profits taxes. We should pair that with Kemp-Roth to cut taxes because of any short-term impact on the price upward. We should burn coal, put a moratorium on our environmental regs until we get domestic gas and oil production up to get out from under this horrifying dependence. And indeed, we should go forward with nuclear, which to date still has proven to be the safest and the cleanest and the cheapest form of new energy to come on stream in this country.
Senator Baker.
Well, to begin with, I do not favor a 50-cent tax on gas. I think it discriminates against those states where you have to drive, where you can't take a subway if you wanted to, or in many other cases, any kind of public transportation. You got to drive your car. And I think it's unfair from that standpoint. What can a Republican president do? I think a lot better. The principal problem with the Carter administration's energy program is that we're on their third program. President Carter started out as a candidate for deregulation and decontrol. Then he changed his mind and went for controls at very high prices. And then he changed his mind again. We've got to get the energy business back into the free enterprise, creative sector of the American economy. But we've also got to have a windfall profits tax to cushion that impact on people who will be most affected by the huge increases in prices that will occur, and to provide a disincentive, to provide a reason for people not to gouge the public.
Our next question, which will be the final question from the panel, will be from Mr. Anthon to Governor Connally.
Governor Connally, last August you suggested that Senator Kennedy would be condoning, and I quote, a double standard of morality, close quote, if he did not instruct his Draft Kennedy movement to abide by campaign financing limits. Now you've said you won't abide by campaign spending limits in several states in your effort to win the Republican nomination. Is that a double standard of morality?
Absolutely not. Those are two entirely different things. When I made the statement about Senator Kennedy last August, he had so-called volunteer groups all over this country working to further his campaign. Under the law, those particular organizations were operating totally without any constraints of the federal law that Senator Kennedy supported, sponsored, and voted for, that restrained what people could do in a presidential campaign. So that's entirely different from what I did. What I said was that I don't believe in federal financing of presidential campaigns, and I don't believe in federal financing of congressional campaigns. I think these proposals are frankly for the benefit of perpetuating incumbents in office, and I'm opposed to them. And I've said that I'm not going to take taxpayers' dollars to run my campaign with. There's nothing wrong with that. I just said if I can't raise the money, I can't win anyway. And I think all of us ought to be out raising our own money, and I challenge all of my colleagues here on the podium this evening to do the same. If they think it's such an enormous advantage for me not to take taxpayers' dollars to run my campaign on, then they can join me. They have that option. And let me make it clear that all that we do, we're relieved of the spending limits. The same laws still apply to us with respect to contributions. No one can contribute any more to me than can contribute to Ambassador Bush, who's going to take matching funds, and he's qualified apparently for $859,000 within the last week. And but I'm under my contributors are under the same constraints as his contributors. I'm just not taking taxpayers' dollars, and I invite all of my colleagues to join me.
Senator Dole.
Well, if I could figure out a way to get part of your matching money, I would be happy to make the application, but I understand that wouldn't be permissible. And I don't have any quarrel with Governor Connolly. That's his right. That's the way the law was drafted. Many of us voted for it. It is tougher, though, for some to raise money, particularly those who are employed. And I'm in the Senate on a full-time basis. I left there with a 93% plus voting and attendance record this year. I felt a responsibility to do my job. I mean, you're there working every day. You just can't be in Iowa or somewhere else. And I used to say about Governor Connolly, he went through town with a vacuum cleaner. I came along with a whisk broom trying to sweep up the crumbs. But that's his right. He's a good money raiser. And when he drops out later on, I hope he's going to help me raise some money.
Ambassador Bush?
I agree that Governor Connolly should do exactly what he wants. He is right within the law. I will accept matching funds. We've worked hard. It's been difficult to raise money. But as the campaign has begun to move forward, money comes in better, and you can get it. And I don't believe I need to spend more in Iowa than the law permits if I take matching funds. And I believe more in building organization. The endorsement today by Congressman Talkey and yesterday by Congressman Leach. These are more important to me than being able to spend more heavily than the law permits if I accept matching funds. So it's dealer's choice. He'll do his thing. I'll do mine.
Congressman Crane.
I totally respect the decision that Governor Connolly has made with regard to the question of matching funds. I personally have objections to the concept of public financing of campaigns, but I acknowledged at the outset of my campaign that with the simultaneous limitations on the amounts individuals can give, I would take matching funds rather than jeopardize my campaign. And if anyone is prepared to repeal all the laws on that subject, which I voted against and I still think are both unconstitutional and unfair, I will happily join him. I must confess that there is a handicap in working then within the constraints if you take matching funds of the total amount you can spend in a state, but I do believe that the most invaluable contribution in any campaign are those workers at the precinct level. And they're giving you the most precious thing any person can give, and that's time out of their lives. And so I welcome the support of all of those volunteers, and I need them desperately here in Iowa.
Senator Baker.
There's an old saying that there isn't much difference between enough money and all the money in the world, but there's a whale of a difference between not enough money and enough money. I don't think it takes an unlimited amount of money to do well in a political campaign. My own judgment is that the will of the country and of the people of Iowa is to see some sort of reasonable limitation on expenditures. My friend John Connolly is entitled to abide by that section of the statute which permits him to refuse to take federal funds and then to escape the expenditure limitations. But I think it's a mistake, and I think it will have political impact and political implications. Now, that's a judgment, fortunately, that the people of Iowa and the United States will make and that John and I can disagree on. But I think it has political implications beyond just the dollars involved, and I made a contrary judgment. I'm willing to accept the limitation, and I therefore accept the federal funds.
Congressman Anderson.
Well, I disagree with Mr. Connolly and his unwillingness to abide by campaign spending limits. I think $15 or $16 million for a campaign, for a presidential campaign and the primaries ought to be enough for any man. Those are not tax dollars that he's talking about. Those are dollars that have been checked off voluntarily by taxpayers when they file their federal income tax form. And I agree with the former chairman of Common Cause, John Gardner, that quiet revolution was wrought in the manner of financing presidential campaigns when in 1976, for the first time, we made the matching fund provision available to presidential candidates. I would like to see it extended to congressional and senatorial campaigns. He says it's an Incumbent Protection Act. Believe me, if that were so, those fellows down there would have passed it a long time ago because they found plenty of other ways to vote themselves perquisites of office.
Thank you, gentlemen. Our time for the panel questioning period has now expired, and we will turn to questions from the audience. The first two questions from the audience will be posed by two Iowa high school students who were the winners of a contest sponsored by the Register and Tribune. We asked the students in all of the high schools of Iowa to submit the questions that they would like to ask the candidates, and the two students with us tonight are the winners in that contest. Each student will state his or her question, and each of the 6 candidates will have 1 minute to respond. We will begin with Carrie Munns of Early, Iowa, a junior at Crestland High School. Ms. Munns, your question, please.
In your opinion, how does our military strength rank in comparison to other countries? Also, what are your views concerning reinstatement of the draft?
Congressman Crane.
In my estimation, our military capability has fallen behind the Soviets in both conventional and strategic weapons. That's why I have been a very outspoken opponent of SALT II. I think SALT II would be disastrous to our national security interest, and I think the President, if he truly believed what he said last night, that it would promote stability and peace, notwithstanding the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, then he shouldn't have talked about shelving it. The fact is that he knows the votes aren't there, and thank goodness the American people know that it is not in our national security interest. On the draft, I worked very hard for a volunteer military because I believe in the principle of voluntarism. I believe the concept is still workable, but we do have needs in terms of our ready reserve. Clifford Alexander, Secretary of the Army, told me about $300 million increased spending in behalf of our ready reserve would bring it up to speed. But I do feel that in peacetime, to the extent we can continue to work with the volunteer military concept, we should.
Senator Baker.
I think the United States is still militarily stronger than the Soviet Union. But I don't think we'll be much longer unless we reverse some of the decisions that have been made by the Carter administration in the last 2.5 years. I think, as an example, that the President made a serious mistake when he canceled the production of our only advanced manned bomber, the B-1, when he reduced by 50% the size of the Navy shipbuilding program, when he delayed the development and deployment of the MX missile, and so on the list goes. We'll pay the price for those things in the 1980s, and we will still have a serious challenge in the 1980s as to whether we can maintain even parity with the Soviet Union. I hope we can by reversing some of those policies. I do not now favor the resumption of peacetime conscription. I don't rule out that prospect in the face of great international danger. I do not support it at this time.
Congressman Anderson.
I would be opposed to the reinstatement of the draft. I voted for and strongly supported the creation of a voluntary army. I do not believe that we have become a weak and pitiful giant. I do not think that we are number 2 militarily in the world. This is not to say that we cannot design perhaps a leaner, tougher, better fighting force than we have today, that our general purpose forces could not be improved, that some components of our Navy should not be strengthened. But to suggest that as one element of this program we ought to invest not $35 billion as the administration said, but $55 billion in an MX missile is to me not the wisest, most judicious use of our nation's resources. Because without SALT II, it is clear that even the 4,600 multiple protective shelters that would be necessary to complete that system, they would not be enough to really add to the defense of our country. I think that particular expenditure would be unwise, foolish, and unnecessary.
Governor Connolly.
When you speak of the military strength of the United States versus the Soviet Union, I think you have to divide it into 2 categories. First, in conventional weapons, there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever but what the Soviet Union has achieved a superiority over the United States in conventional weapons. I think we're still on a parity perhaps with the Soviet Union in strategic nuclear weapons, but that's going to change because of the very things that Senator Baker talked about. We didn't build the B-1, we didn't build the MX, we stretched out the cruise missile, and so forth. In the time frame 1982 to 1983, the Soviets will have perfected the multiple reentry warheads which they're working on. They will have increased their accuracy to where they will have achieved at least parity, if not superiority, and there's not a thing in the world we can do about it at this point. But we should start right now correcting the imbalance that is going to occur in the 1980s, because it'll take us 6 to 7 to 10 years to get a new weapon system in production if we started tomorrow. With respect to the draft, I don't think any of us want to return to the draft unless we feel it's absolutely essential in the interest of this nation.
Senator Dole.
First of all, I'm opposed to reinstatement of the draft, and I don't even see any need at this time for peacetime registration. What we need to do is to beef up our selective service system and computerize our regions of the selective service system. With reference to defense, I still believe that we're number one in the world. I still will vote, as I voted in the past 19 years, to remain number one in the world for the sake of peace. We've just concluded an agreement with NATO countries with reference to cruise missile and the so-called Pershing II missile. It does buttress our defense there. We still have the ability. We've gone downhill since President Ford left office by about $68 billion in defense spending, but we're coming back up that hill because members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, have gotten the message from back home. We want to be strong for the sake of peace.
Ambassador Bush.
For one fascinating year, I had the responsibility, 1976, of telling the President what the relative force balance was in this country vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And it opened my eyes a lot. We are not inferior to the Soviet Union. In some categories in strategic weapons, they're moving ahead of us. They're moving more rapidly than we would have thought in terms of missile accuracy, for example. In conventional forces, there is a slight imbalance in favor of the Soviet Union. But this can be changed by reversing back in some of the things that, many of the things that President Carter cut out of Ford's budget, and now 3 years later wakes up and kind of says, well, I was wrong, you can't trust the Russians, we're going to have to change them. I favor registration. The call-up time is too long. It should be done. I support it as a member of the Congress. The volunteer army concept, some of the things about it trouble me. I don't believe yet we need a draft, but if we do, as president, I'll say this. We need a draft. It's going to be a fair draft. Some ghetto kid is not going to be urged to carry the rifle while some wealthy kid studies to get a PhD. And what's wrong with the concept of service to the United States?
Thank you. Our second question is from Gary Forsyth of West Bend, Iowa, a senior at West Bend Community High School. Mr. Forsyth, your question, please.
Living here in the breadbasket of America, it is hard for others and myself to understand the impact other countries have with oil, while we carry little influence with our food. Therefore, would you be in favor of a food for crude policy?
If I thought it was workable, yes, indeed, I would favor it. The unfortunate thing is, even if we could put together a coalition between the United States, Canada, Argentina, and Australia, if you look at some of the major oil-producing countries, and Saudi Arabia is a good example, it's a country of about 4.5 million people, approximately Chicago population. There are enough alternative sources for food to offset the leverage that putting that kind of a food cartel together might try and wield, that I don't think we'd be successful. I think the better answer than getting into cartel formation and that kind of international trade warfare is to increase the production of energy, get ourselves out from under this dependency. We have the capability, the resources here at home. If we will just turn loose those creative talents and restore the climate once more to be productive, we don't have to talk in terms of creating international cartels to fight back against other nations in this world.
Senator Baker.
I honestly don't agree with the idea of a food for crude policy. I don't think that the sale, the supply, or the withholding of foodstuffs to other nations of the world is a useful, effective, or appropriate technique of foreign policy for this country. I think if we go down that road, where do you stop? You decide to starve this country or to supply that one. I think it doesn't make any difference whether it's crude today and something else tomorrow, that it is unseemly for the United States to take the position that starvation should be an element of our foreign policy technique. That's what we criticize so roundly in Cambodia. I think it is not suitable to our national personality, and besides that, I don't think it'll work.
Congressman Anderson.
Even though I do support the use of food in connection with the message that I think it is imperative we send to the Soviet Union to forestall further aggressive actions on her part that might well lead to World War III. This does not mean that I would embrace that concept on each and every occasion. And I would have to agree that with respect to OPEC, I do not believe that it would be an effective weapon. However, this does not mean that I am opposed to using our agricultural abundance and our food as a weapon. I think we ought to use it as a weapon to fight world hunger. We've just had a report from the President's Commission on Hunger, illustrating for us just how deep that need is and still remains. And I would be very much in favor of taking as much of that 17 million metric tons that will not go to the Soviet Union as possible, and by concessional sales, by grant aid, making sure that it reaches the hungry people of the world.
Governor Connolly.
I know it's tempting to talk about food for crude. I agree with those who've already spoken that it won't work because of the nature of the countries where most of the crude is produced. And it also, as Senator Baker says, violates one of the basic precepts of this country. We don't believe in the formation of cartels, even to break cartels. OPEC is a cartel. But how do you break it? You break it not by organizing other cartels. You break it, frankly, by developing the energy resources we have at home. We have the oil shales, we have nuclear power, we have oil and gas, we have coal in abundance. We're not short of energy resources. We're short of energy, usable energy. And that's our fault. That's not OPEC's fault. We're a hostage in their hands because we failed to live up to the responsibilities that we should have recognized long ago. And so I don't think that the policy of food for crude will work. The only answer is to produce from domestic sources the energy that we need, and we'll break that cartel.
Senator Dole.
Well, it's not realistic. I mean, it sounds good, and I've heard the song, but it's not realistic. It seems to me that we get back to the basic question. We've just, most of us have condemned the embargo. We'd in effect be imposing selective embargoes. Most of us say we don't support. But I do believe that we have a great opportunity through our Food for Peace program, as I said earlier, which was an Eisenhower program, a Republican program passed in 1954. We've dispensed over $35 billion in food around the world. We have an opportunity, as I said earlier on, to take some of this 17 million tons that's not going to go to the Soviet Union now and help the needy in the world through concessional sales, through PL 480. That embargo alone will cost the farmers of Iowa over $200 million. It's going to cost the American farmer in the next 5 years, by conservative estimates, some $20 billion. So we can use our food in the right way. I don't think the crude for food is the right way.
Ambassador Bush.
Well, I agree food for crude is not viable. Congressman Crane spelled out the major economic reasons for that. I do think that there's a way to break the cartel. Governor Connolly pointed to part of it. And another part of it is this, that the moderate Arab countries are increasingly concerned as they see action in the Middle East that they think risks overthrowing them and their interests. And so I think we need to shift our foreign policy to assure our friends that we plan to be committed, be constant in our foreign policy, can be depended on. And then once they believe that, you can sit down with them, not on food for crude, but on a wide array of things they need from the West, and I think pull those moderate Arabs, hopefully, away from that cartel action.
Thank you. We will turn now to questions from members of the audience chosen at random. These questions will be addressed to one candidate only, and he will be allowed up to 1 minute to respond. There will be no responses from the other candidates. We ask the questioners to give their names and their hometown, and to state their questions briefly. We will go to microphone A for the first question, which will be addressed to Senator Dole, where we left off with the panel questioning earlier. The question, please, for Senator Dole.
I am Craig Fitzgerald from Collins, Iowa, and I would like Senator Dole to tell me, does he support federal legislation calling for uniform weights and sizes on trucks and tractors throughout the United States?
I would support such legislation. I've seen trucks go through this country with going down back roads to avoid main highways, paying fees in every state across this country, increasing the cost again to the free enterprise trucker. And I think it's time we address that either through an interstate compact or through legislation.
Thank you. Our next question will be for Ambassador Bush. Your question, please.
Joanne Loggins, Des Moines, Iowa. President Carter has shown considerable concern about the number of undocumented workers in our country. What are your views about undocumented aliens?
My views about undocumented aliens is that we have made illegal people that do perform a service that others are not willing to perform. And so I favor a return to some kind of documentation, so on a selective basis, not year-round, not always here, but so that these people are not compelled to enter this country illegally. I think you have to look at the numbers so that you don't deprive people in this country of jobs. But the idea that you should not permit some people to come into this country for selective labor simply does not have any appeal to me. So I favor a return to some kind of documentation like we had in the past.
Thank you. Our next question will be for Congressman Crane. Your question, please.
I'm Dan Jepson from Ankeny, Iowa. Representative Crane, as a former college professor, what do you see as the major flaws in our educational system, and what would you, as president, do about them?
Well, you've got me on my favorite subject now. You know, we've had declining SAT scores for about 15 consecutive years. After spending more money on higher education in the post-World War II era than we spent in our entire national experience before, we've reached the exalted state where we teach remedial reading at the college and university level. I'll tell you frankly, one thing that we must do is go back and start teaching basics at the early primary grade level. Mastery of reading skills is absolutely essential. You can teach yourself a lot in life, but you can't if you don't know how to read. And we're creating functional illiteracy. Secondly, I think we've got to go back and put a greater emphasis on vocational technical training so that those people who are brought up under adverse circumstances can begin to acquire the skills that can be translated into job opportunities. We have locked many people in the inner cities into a situation where there is absolutely no hope, nothing but desperation, because they have not been taught how to read and they've not been taught functional skills. And that has been in part, I think, a degree of a little bit of intellectual snobbery on the part of some who said a liberal arts education is the only important education.
Thank you. Our next question will be for Senator Baker. State your question, please.
Linda Faber, Des Moines, Iowa. Why has the Senate done absolutely nothing to reduce the current tax brackets? Most middle-class families need 2 incomes to exist, and by exist I mean buy hamburger every other week. Yet they're being forced into tax brackets where they don't belong, and the United States government is reaping in more money now than ever before.
There's no doubt on earth but that one of the cruelest aspects of inflation is the effect it has on the tax rate and the tax bill that the average citizen must pay in this country. And inflation has escalated people in low and middle income brackets to brackets they never dreamed of paying taxes in before. But the answer is not, in my judgment, to index the tax brackets or even to change the effective tax schedule, but rather to conquer inflation. And I honestly believe we can do that. It'll take a little while, it'll take a lot of tough decisions. But President Gerald Ford did that. He took office with inflation running at double-digit rates, and he wrestled it to the ground. It was 4.8% in the last quarter when he left office as President of the United States. That is the answer, is to control and contain inflation. President Carter came to office with a 4.8% inflation rate. He let that animal out of the cage, and the next president is going to have to put it back.
Thank you. We will go now to a question for Congressman Anderson. Go ahead, please.
Congressman Anderson, my name is Rick Phillips, and I hail from this great city of Des Moines, Iowa. It's been obvious that the public sector has been unable to deal effectively with inflation and our economy. My question is this: what do you feel the private sector's role should be in regards to our economy?
Well, clearly the private sector does have a responsibility. I think it has a responsibility, both labor and management have a responsibility to hold down wages and prices during a period when inflation has reached double-digit levels. I think also probably in the productivity area, the fact that we have had at least 2 straight years now of declining productivity. Last year, the Japanese had a productivity increase of 10%. And in this country, of course, it was practically a negative rate. So we aren't doing the things, I think, in the private sector that we should to replace machinery, plant, equipment with new and more innovative and productive technology. Now, government has a role in that, but I think we've got to have some innovation. We've got to have some willingness on the part of both labor and management to participate in this tremendous job of increasing the productivity of our country.
We will take a question now for Governor Connolly. Go ahead, please.
Stuart Gant, Des Moines, Iowa. Governor Connolly, in response to an earlier question, one of your colleagues made reference to the fact that he felt we had too much regulation in this country. Deregulation has already taken place within the airline industry, and the move is currently underway to deregulate other industry. What is your position on deregulation of such industry, and in particular, the deregulation of the trucking industry and interstate commerce?
I think the deregulation of the airline industry has been a mixed blessing. I'm one of those who believe that there's too much regulation in this country, in almost every industry, at almost every level. I don't think there's any question about it. When you look at the problems, though, of the government, you have to set priorities. And when you look at the priorities of this country, when you talk about the need to increase our appropriations for defense, when you talk about the fight we have to make against inflation, to slow the rate of federal spending, to balance this budget, to curb the bureaucracy, to provide for equality in the marketplaces of the world in terms of our trade, to develop an energy policy, all of these things have a much higher priority than any program, it seems to me, to deregulate the trucking industry. You know, there's an old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And, you know, the trucking industry is doing a great service in this country. Of all the things that we don't need to get into at the moment, it seems to me it's the trucking industry, and I wouldn't now put the deregulation of the trucking industry high on my list of priorities.
Thank you. We'll return now for another question for Senator Dole. Go ahead, please.
I am Steve Haughey from Corydon, Iowa, and I would like to ask Senator Dole what he would plan to do to help out the railroad industry.
About 3 weeks ago in the Congress and the Senate, we adopted an amendment that I co-sponsored, which would have provided about $1 billion to help the beleaguered railroad industry. I've studied carefully the problems in the state of Iowa with the Milwaukee and the Rock Island Railroads, both in bankruptcy. It seemed to me that we must address the problem because they're now under a directed service order, and there has been a plan presented as recently as last week, a core plan, which would put the railroads back in action. I don't believe we should let some company come in and just buy up the best part of the Rock Island Railroad. We may have to get into an area where we at least, with some federal funds, improve the road beds. I'm opposed to nationalizing the railroads or government takeover of railroads, but let's face it, again, the farmers get it on the chin. They raise the commodities, they harvest the commodities, then they can't get into market. We have to improve the transportation system in the Midwest.
We have time for one more question. This final question will be for Ambassador Bush. Go ahead, please.
John Zimmer, Des Moines, Iowa. Ambassador Bush, sir, if elected President of the United States and with a high level of immorality in our country, as President, what would you do to contribute to the moral fiber and the moral stability of our country? And how do you feel about gay rights, pornography, and other forms of immorality?
Well, I do believe that we're a moral nation. I believe the emphasis on family and free choice of our religious preference, these kinds of things, concepts of neighborhood, these are important things to us. I don't believe that morality can be legislated. I think breaking up a family can be legislated against, in a sense, some legislation that compels a man and a woman to live apart so that they can do better on aid for dependent children, for example. Those things should be changed. But I believe in separation of church and state. I don't remember the last two parts of your question. If you don't mind repeating them, I think I remember one of them, but what was the other?
Gay rights and immorality and pornography and other forms of immorality.
Well, I believe that pornography and those matters are best controlled at the state level. I believe that I do not favor codification of gay rights in law. And yet I don't favor harassment of an individual for that basis or anything of that nature. I just don't want to see our society undermined by codifying that as normal. I'm sorry, I don't accept it as that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen. Our time for audience questions has now expired, and it is time for closing statements from each of the candidates. We would like to remind the candidates that the closing statements are limited to 3 minutes. We will begin with Congressman Crane.
I would like, first of all, Jim, to congratulate you as the man who inspired this program. I would like to congratulate also the Des Moines Register-Tribune for having been the official sponsor and host of this evening. I would like to congratulate further Public Service Broadcasting for covering this in its entirety, and I understand CBS is doing likewise for a delayed broadcast. And I think the panelists here, Walter and George and Mary and Richard, and all of you folks in the audience and all of that viewing audience are to be congratulated too. I think it is a major public service that has been performed. It is unique in the annals of politics, and I doubt we're going to see this happen again in this campaign. It's been a fun experience, and I've enjoyed sharing this platform with my distinguished colleagues who were here tonight. Let me comment on just one thing in summation here. You know, Frederick Douglass, the famous black civil rights leader in the post-Civil War era, Frederick Douglass was a man born in slavery. He became a very outspoken advocate of civil rights. He was a man who was a great author and orator as well. He said, "I am a Republican. A black Republican dyed in the wool, and I never intend to belong to any other party than the party of freedom and progress." I think the bottom line of what we as Republicans have stood for, what I believe in personally, what has been the foundation of this nation's greatness and will continue to be the foundation of this nation's greatness, is freedom as a precondition for its natural corollary progress. The two go hand in glove. Frederick Douglass was a man who understood that profoundly, having been born in slavery. And I would argue that those who don't appreciate the importance of fighting this battle to preserve freedom should have had the opportunity to talk to a man who was born in slavery. But they're not denied the opportunity, because you can talk to the boat people, you can talk to those in our society who fled from the butchery of Budapest when the Soviets crushed the uprising in '56, or those who managed to get out of Prague in 1968. We still are fighting that eternal battle, and we will ever be fighting the eternal battle. Now, there are certain things that I was brought up to believe in on the south side of Chicago, growing up out there by the steel mills in a not affluent environment during the Depression years. And that was that, one, we started out each day in school with a prayer, because we acknowledged that this nation was founded under God, and it is upon that premise that our freedoms ultimately rest. Secondly, we pledged allegiance to that flag, which we honored, as all of you honored, because we knew it was a symbol of that blood and treasure invested by Americans every generation to preserve this, the world's last best hope. That's the special mission, harking back to a question earlier this evening, that we have as a nation. It's a mission we can fulfill, and in the process realize that grand dream expressed so eloquently by Abraham Lincoln, that this nation under God would have a rebirth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not perish from the earth.
Senator Baker.
Mr. Gannon, thank you very much. I join Congressman Crane in paying my respects to you and to the Register-Tribune Company for their sponsorship of this event. It's been a privilege for me to appear on this platform with 5 distinguished Republicans. I think this is proof of the fact that the Republican Party is vital, that we are willing to discuss, to compare notes, and to ventilate our ideas and our differences in public, and that we have an understanding and that we acknowledge that politics is an important secular undertaking in this country, that politics is the mechanism by which men and women in this country formulate their future public policy. Politics is not just a game. Politics is not beneath us. It's not something to shy away from. It is the way we will decide the future of this nation. And I'm happy, Mr. Gannon, to be on this platform tonight with these fellow Republicans and to share this opportunity that you've made possible. There are great decisions that the country must make in the campaign of 1980. And no place in the United States will you find more leverage residing in the hands of the citizens of a single state than you do in the state of Iowa. Far more than in 1976, the people of Iowa will have a profound impact on the choice of the next president of the United States, because it's here where early momentum will be developed, where the sorting out process will begin in both parties. And it is important then, indeed it is vital, that the outpouring of participants in the Iowa caucuses on January 21st be so large that it becomes the functional equivalent of a primary, a broad base of participation. And I will happily abide by the judgment of the people of Iowa in that respect. But the judgments and the decisions to be made are in two great categories: of foreign policy, of economic and social policy. It grieves me to say, but I must say in the context of political responsibility, that the United States now has and is witnessing a failed foreign policy. That Iran, Afghanistan, South Yemen, combat troops, Russian combat troops in Cuba, Somalia, Ethiopia, all of these things are symptoms of the fact that the United States is no longer thought of as a strong deterrent force to aggression by any other country or as a threat to freedom. Our policy has been characterized as one of too little, too late. We've lost our margin for error in foreign policy, and we must change it. And to do that, in my view, we must change our president. In the second category, inflation. We've spoken of at length the fact that President Ford wrestled it to the ground. We can do it again. And I believe every one of us will pledge ourselves to a reiteration in the belief of the free enterprise system, of the private market system, and the ability of America to produce new wealth for the benefit of mankind.
Congressman Anderson.
Mr. Gannon, I too am grateful to you and the Des Moines Register for this opportunity to participate in the debate tonight. You know, I would agree with what has just been said, that respect for the United States has declined around the world, that we have suffered a loss of prestige, and yet the central thrust of my campaign for the presidency has been this: I think that has happened because the dollar has become a mere tattered symbol of what it once was. I think it has happened because we have not had the self-discipline here at home to deal with the problem of inflation. I think it has happened because here at home we've had what I said in response to that young man's question a moment ago. We've had a decline in productivity, and we no longer seem to be on the cutting edge of that kind of progress and innovativeness and high technology that we once were. And I think all of these things have happened, and yet, why am I different? I didn't get to answer Miss McGrory's question quite to her satisfaction earlier. What makes you, John Anderson, think that you are different from these others who are competing with you for the nomination? It seems to me that for the most part, they are seeing the problems of America in the context of power, whereby we flex our muscles, and with bigger budgets for defense and with more military spending and with trying to project our power around the world, this is going to solve the problem. You know, when my father, my Swedish father, journeyed as an immigrant to this country almost 80 years ago, he didn't come because he thought that life would be easy. He came because he knew this country stood for hard work, it stood for opportunity, it stood for individual freedom, it stood for basic moral courage. A lot of Americans today are wondering, my generation and younger generations in this audience everywhere across the country are wondering about the future of this country. because they see that inflation, they see the mounting deficits, they see the weakened dollar, they see the economic subservience to the oil cartel, they worry about the decline in our international position, and yet they see the politicians by and large playing the game the same old way. It's the same old politics. We'll come out here to Iowa and we won't talk to the Iowa farmer and tell him we're going to expect some sacrifice maybe from him in the way of supporting this effort that we're now making to tell the Russians that we draw a line and they're not going to go on with the kind of conquest that they have just practiced in Afghanistan. I'm afraid that there's too much old politics being practiced even among Republicans today, and I say that even though I respect and admire every one of the men in this group tonight. And yet I think the country is looking for something different. Every one of them has ridiculed my plan to go to the American people and tax them 50 cents a gallon for gasoline and redistribute that among the workers of this country by cutting their Social Security taxes. And yet I haven't heard, other than in vague generalities, what they would do to solve the energy problem. And that's the meaning of Iran, that's the meaning of Afghanistan, that's the meaning of the instability of the Middle East today, is this awful dependence on the part of the United States on foreign oil. We've got to pull up our socks in this country. We've got to be willing to sacrifice something today in order to secure a better future and a better tomorrow. It's not going to be easy.
Thank you.
It wasn't easy for my father. It won't be easy for us, but we can do it.
Thank you, Congressman. Governor Connolly.
Mr. Gannon, thank you very much. Thank the Des Moines Register-Tribune. I want to express my personal thanks to members of the panel who have been with us this evening, and I want to express to all of you and to all of those in the audience that I've enjoyed being here this evening. I've been interested in the statements that the other candidates made, at least those who cared enough to come tonight. But in these closing moments, I think we need to focus on what's happening in this world, the effect that it's going to have on the lives of Iowans and Americans. I think in the next decade, we're going to face the greatest crisis that this nation has faced since World War II, and perhaps one of the most serious in the entire life of this nation. We have been blessed with freedom and security because of our military strength. We've been blessed with opportunity in America because of our economic strength. We've been protected throughout all the life of this nation by time and distance. Those were our two great allies. But since World War II, they have disappeared. Time and distance are no longer our allies. The 1980s is going to be a time when we'll witness a changing world. It's going to be a different world. It's going to be a dangerous world. We're going to be living in a world with many strange paradoxes. We're going to be living in a world where a Chrysler Corporation is on the verge of bankruptcy and a Ford Motor Company closes 13 plants and lays off tens of thousands of workers in the last few weeks. At the same time, we continue to import more and more Japanese automobiles. We're living at a time when the President of the United States is going to shortchange Iowans by withholding grain without a firm commitment from Canada and Australia and Argentina that they're going to join in this embargo. We're living at a time when we're going to deny high technology and sophisticated equipment to the Soviet Union without receiving assurances from France and Italy and Germany and Britain and Japan and our principal trading partners and allies around the world that they won't fill the void, that they won't rush in and sell what we have refused to sell. We're witnessing a time when Americans, all Americans, not just those few hapless people in Tehran in that embassy, but all Americans today are hostages. We're hostages to the OPEC countries of the world because we fail to live up to the opportunities and responsibility to use the resources that we have in the United States to achieve a security and a self-sufficiency in energy resources. We live in a world where gold hits over $600 an ounce, up from $35 an ounce just a few years ago. We're in a world where the dollar deteriorates almost every single day that passes. Why? Because of a lack of confidence and faith in the American economic system, which that dollar reflects. We live in a world where we have fewer and fewer allies and friends throughout this world. And for the first time in 200 years, foreign events are impacting this nation, our lives, our security, our standard of living. Now, how'd this all happen? It happened for many different reasons.
Governor, I don't think you're going to have time to tell us how it all happened because your time has expired. Thank you. Senator Dole.
Thank you very much. I appreciate very much the audience being here, and I recognize Governor Ray and Billy in the audience, and we're always happy to see the governor. We always mention the governor as we travel around Iowa with an 83% approval rating. We all do it. We're proud of Governor Ray, and I say that very sincerely. I'm from Kansas. I'm the only Midwesterner in this race. I love my country. I love politics. I love the Republican Party. The real Midwest, that is. And I've been wondering for some time, as I stood on the Senate floor day after day after day, if the voters and I really appreciated my 19 years' experience in the House and the Senate. I've wondered from time to time whether Iowa voters were aware of my role in World War II and the strength I've gained through adversity. I've wondered sometimes the Iowa voters knew about my chairmanship of the Republican Party, my work in the party, and my campaign with Jerry Ford in 1976. Oh, I could say the Carter record is dismal, and it is. We've got a lot of problems. We've discussed them tonight. But what am I going to do about it? We can all stand here and criticize and say how bad it is, but what will Bob Dole do about it? Who is the best qualified candidate here tonight, or the best qualified candidate tonight, period? I think I am. I say that modestly, I hope. As a ranking Republican on the Finance Committee, we talk about a balanced budget. I've been there. I'm trying for a balanced budget. I'm trying to limit spending and taxation. Oh, we talk about the middle class and middle American, but one of us has seriously proposed to index the federal tax system like you've done in Iowa. And one of us has introduced a bill to provide catastrophic coverage for serious illness. And everybody talks about agriculture in Iowa. But who's been on the Ag Committee in the House for 8 years and the Senate 11 years? Who knows it like the back of his hand? Oh, there's much talk about the energy crisis. But only one of us supported a realistic windfall profits tax and new incentives for energy conservation, including gasohol. We talk about American strength, but only one of us voted against the Panama Canal giveaway. But in the end, you make the decision on your perception of the candidate. Has this man grown in public service? Has he demonstrated compassion, commitment, competence? And I just say to the voters of Iowa, look at my record. It's there to see. Examine it carefully and help me on January 21st.
Thank you. Ambassador Bush.
Well, I too am grateful to the sponsors. I want very much to win the Republican nomination. I've worked hard. I've been to Iowa many times and other states across this country. I believe I have a breadth of experience fighting for my country in wartime, building a business, excellence in education, membership in the United States Congress, ambassador in China, ambassador in the United Nations, running the Central Intelligence Agency, and running the National Party that qualifies me for this big job. But much more important than these qualifications, I think I have demonstrated leadership in tough assignments. And I know that I have emerged with my integrity totally intact and with the integrity of the organizations that I headed intact. I was lucky. I've had a strong family. I have had a father that inculcated into his sons a sense of service. I believe in the fiber, in the integrity, and the honor of this country. I am sick and tired of apologizing for the United States and hearing us wring our hands about our weaknesses. I want to be a part of the answer, not a part of the problem. And that's why I need your help as we go into these Iowa caucuses on January 21st. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. That completes our forum. We're very grateful to each of the candidates for being here tonight and for their kind words, and we thank the panel and the audience for their participation. And now, good night from Des Moines, Iowa.